At 6 in the morning on Christmas Eve, Clara read the text from her daughter-in-law. "We need space. Don't call." She set her mug down. No shaking, no tears, just a single glance out the window. The car was gone. 4 days at a beach resort for the rest of them. 4 days of peace and quiet for Clara. And 4 days was all the time she needed to make this house hers again. The coffee was steaming in Clara's favorite mug when her phone buzzed on the kitchen table. It was exactly 6 o'clock on Christmas Eve, Christmas morning. On Christmas morning, and outside, a thin blanket of frost dusted the old pines in the yard. Clara, 61 and widowed for 5 years, cherished this morning stillness in her spacious home on the outskirts of Portland. With a steady hand, she unlocked her screen and read the text from her daughter-in-law, Brenda. "We need space. Don't call." Clara set the phone aside and took a slow sip of her coffee. No tears, no shaking, no racing heart. She was a woman who took life's punches in stride. Her son Julian and Brenda had moved into the renovated upstairs apartment of her house 2 years ago. At the time, they'd agreed to split the skyrocketing utility bills and celebrate the holidays together. But over the last few months, Brenda had slowly taken over the reins. Suddenly, she was dictating who used the shared laundry room and when, increasingly treating Clara like an unwelcome guest in her own property. Julian usually just stood by, too spineless to say a word. Clara stood up and walked to the window. Outside, Brenda's compact car was missing from the driveway. It had been packed to the brim the night before. They had driven off without saying a single word in the dead of winter, presumably to some coastal resort Brenda had been eyeing in travel brochures. They had simply abandoned Clara on the biggest holiday of the year, fully expecting to emotionally punish or intimidate her. But Clara didn't feel sad. She felt a deep, cold clarity. She looked at the kitchen calendar. They would be gone for at least 4 days. 4 days where the house belonged entirely to her. She walked into the hallway, looked at the heavy ring of keys hanging by the door, and made a final decision. Brenda thought she could call the shots here. Huge mistake. Clara walked purposefully down to the basement. The house was eerily quiet when Clara came back up the basement stairs. She hadn't done anything dramatic, just turned the upstairs thermostat down to the legal minimum required to keep the pipes from freezing. After all, if they needed space from her, it only made sense that they shouldn't be using her resources without asking. It was pure logic. Clara sat down at her desk in the living room. In front of her lay the thick black binder containing the house deeds. The property was entirely in her name. Julian and Brenda merely paid a small monthly stipend that barely covered the rising energy bills. There was no written lease. Everything was based on verbal agreements from a time when their relationship was still built on mutual respect. Lately, Brenda had been dropping heavy hints that Clara should sign the house over to Julian sooner rather than later for tax purposes. A smaller cottage is plenty of room for an older woman living alone, she had said during their last dinner together. Clara ran her hand over the smooth paper of the deed. She thought about all the petty slights from the past few weeks, how Brenda had taken down the old family photos in the hallway and replaced them with modern, abstract prints, how Julian had looked away when his wife asked Clara to stay out of the backyard because they wanted their privacy. Clara packed the documents away neatly. She went upstairs to the young couple's apartment, using the master key she legally possessed as the homeowner. The apartment was left in a mess with dirty dishes piled in the sink. Clara didn't clean a thing. She simply picked up the espresso machine and the high-end vacuum cleaner she had loaned them a year ago, carrying them downstairs without a word. If they wanted space, they were going to get the full experience. She locked the connecting door. What came next was physical reinforcement. On the first business day after the holidays, the weather was gray and biting. Clara drove her sedan to a small commercial district on the edge of town. She had known Warren, the local locksmith and security specialist, for over 20 years. He had installed the deadbolts on her windows back when her husband was still alive. He was someone she could trust. Morning. Clara Warren greeted her, wiping his hands on his apron. "What can I do for you today?" "I need a new lock for the front door," Clara said, her voice calm and precise. "And 3 new cylinders for the interior connecting doors. Ideally, a modern system where the keys can't be copied without a security card." Warren nodded, asking no questions. He knew the dynamics of plenty of families in town and recognized when it was time to take action. "I've got an opening this afternoon. I'll swing by and take care of it for you." The upgrade cost a pretty penny, about $1,200. But Clara paid in cash from her personal savings, which she kept completely separate from the emergency joint account she had once shared with Julian. She had already closed that account via online banking the day before transferring the remaining balance to her private fund. Julian hadn't contributed a dime to it anyway. When she got back home, she felt a profound sense of relief. She fixed herself a simple but comforting lunch: potato salad and hot dogs, a quiet nod to tradition. At exactly 4 in the afternoon, Warren's van pulled into the driveway. The sound of the drill in the hallway sounded like a victory march to Clara. Every new lock separated her privacy from her daughter-in-law's sheer entitlement. When Warren left, he handed her 5 shiny, heavy keys. The click of the deadbolt sounded absolute. The next step was rearranging the space. On the 3rd day of their absence, Clara turned her attention to the basement. It was a large, dry space divided into several sections. Up until now, Julian and Brenda had used it to store their winter tires, old furniture, and boxes of clothes they didn't need. They had completely hogged the communal space, leaving Clara with barely any room for her own gardening tools and pantry supplies. Clara pulled on a pair of heavy-duty work gloves. She grabbed several empty moving boxes she had kept in the shed and systematically began clearing everything that didn't belong to her out of the shared laundry room and hallways, moving it all into the kids' designated storage unit. She labeled every box clearly with a thick black Sharpie: Brenda's winter clothes, Julian's tools. In the process, she stumbled upon an old box of her son's keepsakes. There were letters from his school days and drawings he'd made for her as a little boy. For a fleeting moment, Clara paused, feeling a pang of nostalgia. But then she remembered the look on his face last Thursday, that blank, cowardly stare, when Brenda forbade her from roasting a chicken on Sundays because the smell drifted upstairs. The nostalgia evaporated instantly. Clara stacked the boxes neatly right up to the ceiling of their small storage unit. When she was finished, she locked that basement door too with one of her new keys. Access to the laundry room and the main utility valves was now strictly restricted to her own key. She went upstairs, washed her hands, and checked the clock. Tomorrow, they would be back from the resort. Her phone sat silently on the counter. No text, no call. They truly believed she was sitting alone at the kitchen table, crying her eyes out. Clara smiled coldly and reached for a notepad. It was the 4th day. Late afternoon was fading into twilight, and the sky was turning a deep, bruised blue. Clara knew they would be back soon since Julian had to be at work the next morning. She sat down at the dining table and took out a clean sheet of paper. She didn't write long-winded explanations, emotional accusations, or pleas. She listed cold, hard facts. On the paper, she laid out the new terms for living in the house. Starting the 1st of next month, Clara was charging a fair market rent of $1,500, a reasonable rate for an apartment in this neighborhood. Furthermore, she stated in writing that access to the backyard and the basement was being restricted. The laundry room could only be used during specific hours designated by Clara. Beneath the text, she placed one of the new front door keys. Only one. She knew exactly what that would mean. Julian and Brenda would have to coordinate with each other from now on. Brenda would no longer have her own key unless Julian handed over his. It was a subtle but incredibly powerful demonstration of who actually held the power. Clara placed the document right in the middle of the upstairs kitchen counter, right next to the empty sink. Next to it, she laid the paperwork showing she had closed the joint account. She smoothed the paper down one last time, turned off the lights, and went back down to her own apartment. She locked the heavy wooden door behind her and turned on the TV. A documentary about the Canadian wilderness was playing. Clara got comfortable on the couch with a throw blanket. She was entirely at peace and ready for whatever came next. Then the familiar crunch of tires on gravel sounded in the driveway. The moment had arrived. It was just after 8 in the evening when the muffled thud of car doors pierced through the triple-paned windows. Clara muted the TV but remained seated. She heard footsteps on the gravel path, followed by Brenda's loud, echoing laugh, which cut off abruptly when the key failed to turn in the front door lock. There was a frantic jiggling of the doorknob. Again and again, someone tried to force the old key into the cylinder. Then the doorbell rang. It was a long, impatient buzz that shattered the silence of the hallway. Clara didn't move. She waited exactly 2 minutes until the ringing turned into a heavy pounding on the wood. Only then did she stand up, smooth down her clothes, and open the door, just a crack, secured by the brand-new heavy-duty security chain. Outside stood Julian and Brenda, both looking lightly suntanned but sporting deep frowns. "What's going on, Mom?" Julian demanded, visibly upset. "Our key doesn't work." "What did you do to the lock?" Brenda shoved her way to the front, furious. "Have you completely lost your mind? We just get back from vacation and you lock us out in the freezing winter. Open this door right now." Clara looked at the young woman with absolute composure. Her voice was quiet, but incredibly firm. "Good evening. You wanted space and asked me not to call. I respected your wishes. Since you were away, I took the opportunity to update the home's security measures." "Take the chain off, Mom," Julian pleaded. "You can use the side entrance through the patio to go upstairs," Clara said matter-of-factly. "The connecting door is unlocked. Everything you need to know is on your kitchen counter. Good night." She closed the door. It didn't take long before Clara heard heavy footsteps pounding above her head. She went into her kitchen and made herself a cup of chamomile tea. She could hear Brenda pacing upstairs, doors slamming and voices rising in volume. The subflooring of the house was well insulated, but when Brenda screamed, it cut right through the ceiling. They had found the note. Clara sipped her tea. She imagined Brenda reading the terms, seeing the rent demand, and realizing there was only one key on the counter. Suddenly, the phone on Clara's counter started ringing. It was Julian's number. Clara let it ring. Twice, 3 times, 4 times. On the 5th ring, she declined the call and put the phone on silent. Suddenly, there was a loud pounding at the interior connecting door in the stairwell. Julian rattled the knob desperately. "Mom!" "Open the door. We need to talk." "What is this bull about rent, and where is our stuff from the basement?" Clara walked up to the door, but didn't unlock it. She spoke calmly through the wood. "Julian, it's almost 9 o'clock at night. I am not having this discussion at this hour. Your personal belongings are neatly packed in your designated basement storage unit. The key to it is next to your house key. If you don't like the new terms, you are entirely free to find another place to live. You can't do this, Brenda yelled from the background. We have a right to live here. You live here on my dime, Clara replied coldly. And that ends now. We will talk tomorrow at 5 in the evening, not a minute sooner. With that, she walked back to the living room and finished her tea. The next day passed in an icy, suffocating silence. Julian left early for work. Clara heard his car pull out at 6 in the morning. Brenda stayed upstairs. She didn't come down once, likely out of pride, or because she didn't have a key to lock the front door behind her if she left. At exactly 5 p.m., Clara sat at the large dining table in her living room. She had set up 2 chairs directly across from her. There was a knock at the inner door. Clara stood up, unlocked it, and let Julian and Brenda in. Julian looked exhausted with dark circles under his eyes. Brenda stood with her arms tightly crossed, a defiant glare plastered on her face. "Sit down," Clara said, gesturing to the chairs. She remained seated herself, hands resting calmly on the table. "This is extortion, Clara." Brenda snapped, immediately refusing to sit. "You can't just demand rent out of nowhere and take away our keys. We're family." Family. Clara repeated the words slowly. Family doesn't send a text message on Christmas morning to leave an older woman entirely isolated while they go off to a luxury resort. Family respects each other's property. Julian lowered his head. Mom Brenda was stressed out. "But the money, you know we're trying to save up for a new car. Your financial priorities are no longer my concern," Clara told her son. "I have carried the brunt of your living expenses for years. That's over. Either you both sign the rental agreement by tomorrow night and pay the first month's rent retroactively, or you need to pack up and be out by the end of the quarter." Brenda let out a bitter laugh. "And if we don't leave, what are you going to do? Evict us?" Clara looked Brenda dead in the eye. There wasn't a hint of hesitation or fear on her face. She had anticipated this exact reaction. She knew women like Brenda. They relied on the weakness and good nature of others to bully their way through life. If you don't pay, and you don't leave, I will sell the house. Clara said, her voice as cutting as the January wind outside. I already spoke to a real estate agent this morning. The market in this neighborhood is incredibly hot. There's an older couple looking for exactly this kind of layout. I'll take the proceeds, buy myself a nice, low-maintenance condo downtown, and use the rest of the money to travel. Julian bolted upright, panicked. You can't do that. This is Dad's house. It is my house, Julian, Clara corrected him gently but firmly. Your father and I paid it off together. It was meant to be my retirement security, not a free hotel for people who won't even say hello to me when we cross paths in the hallway. Brenda turned pale instantly. It finally clicked that Clara wasn't bluffing. There were no legal loopholes for them to exploit here. Without a lease and without property rights, they were completely powerless. If Clara sold the house, they would be out on the street and their new car fund would be completely wiped out by security deposits and moving fees. We need to talk about this, Julian stammered, tugging at Brenda's sleeve. You have until tomorrow at 6 o'clock, Clara said. Either the signed agreement is in my mailbox or the realtor comes by for the first walkthrough on Saturday. You may go now. She opened the door. New Year's Eve was completely tranquil. Outside, you could hear the occasional pop of early fireworks from the neighbors, but inside the house, the atmosphere was pleasant and peaceful. The signed document had been dropped into Clara's mailbox the night before, right on time at 5 o'clock, signed by both of them without a single extra comment. The first rent payment had already hit Clara's private bank account via an instant transfer. Clara stood in her clean kitchen, preparing a quiet dinner for one. She had bought a fresh piece of salmon and poured herself a glass of crisp white wine. She looked out the window into the dark garden. The power dynamic in the house had been permanently recalibrated. Upstairs, things had become remarkably quiet. Whenever Julian or Brenda used the shared hallway, now they did so quietly, carefully, and politely. They had finally realized that their comfort depended entirely on Clara's goodwill, and that her goodwill came with strict, unshakable boundaries. There probably wouldn't be any warm hugs or big emotional family gatherings anytime soon. But Clara was perfectly fine with that. She had no use for a fake closeness built entirely on self-interest. She had reclaimed her peace and her self-respect, and that was the most valuable gift she could have ever given herself. Taking her glass, she walked into the living room and settled into her armchair. Her phone lay on the side table, silent and undisturbed. She was the master of her own home, independent and free. As the clock struck midnight and fireworks lit up the night sky in vibrant colors, Clara raised her glass to her own reflection in the window. The new year was going to be run entirely by her rules.